back to the Gold and Alternative Investments show. My name is Kerry Stevenson. Now, it's not just gold, it's not just alternative investments like crypto. I also want to talk to people about different sources of energy. So today with me is the Managing Director of Marenica Energy, Murray Hill, and they have a uranium project in Namibia. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're here to talk about today is I want to educate you guys that are listening to this particular chat about the fact that we need to look at nuclear as a fuel source and not freak out about it and not turn around and say, oh my God, Chernobyl, Fukushima, death to all, because it's just not correct information. One of the things that we always have to do is we have to know the facts. We have to understand what's going on. And the more I look into uranium as a fuel source, the more I talk to people like Murray, the more I say to myself, people have got to understand that Chernobyl and Fukushima are not what the mainstream media have been telling you and spreading fear and lies, whereby you all sit there and turn around and say, nuclear is not the answer. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Murray Hill, because we're going to have a chat, aren't we, Murray, about nuclear as a fuel source, about some of the things that are said in the mainstream media, which scares the bejesus out of people for no particular reason, other than maybe it's people with other interests at heart. Because there's a lot of talk at the moment about renewable energy. There's a lot of talk about wind and solar. There's not a lot of talk about uranium as a fuel source, although Rick Rule loves it. Rick Rule thinks it's great.
Yep.
It's starting to get a little bit of attention, and perhaps people are beginning to understand that nuclear energy, which is, by the way, if you have an X-ray, that is nuclear energy, and there is radiation around. It has no carbon emissions. It doesn't take a lot of space. These very small nuclear reactors do not take up a lot of space. Technology has changed insurmountably. But let's start with the first one. Fukushima was not a nuclear accident. It was a tsunami and an earthquake that killed 18,000 odd people. And by the way, we're not turning around saying, discarding the fact that people died. Yes, that's a tragedy. It's awful. We don't like that at all. But I think the first person to be attributed as a death to the Fukushima, as they call it, disaster, and it was a disaster from the tsunami and the earthquake, not from the nuclear, but everybody attributes Fukushima to the meltdown of the nuclear reactor. But if you go and put any nuclear reactor underwater, it's going to have a bit of a reaction, I would think, Murray, wouldn't you?
Yeah, look, there's a few things come to mind while you were speaking there, and one was Shirley Strawn and the Skyhawks, actually, the horror movie. You remember that song?
I do. I could even
when we were
sing
young.
it.
So what was it all about? It was about the 6 o'clock news. It's
That's
a horror
right.
movie. So, the media was supposed to be there to give us the facts for us to make an informed decision as to which side of the fence we sat on. But now the media are there to force us down a path of thinking that they want us to go down. But yeah, sorry, the sort of when you were talking, it just got my mind working about that one. And the other thing is, right, it's a disaster that killed 18,500 people. That's a disaster. The result of that was flooding. Now, the industry has learned a lot since then about if the water coolant source for the reactor was at a higher level, right, it wouldn't have got flooded. If the power source, the backup power source was at a high level, it wouldn't have got flooded. So I've heard since that some of the states, nuclear reactors in the US have 3 sources of water, right? Their primary source, a backup source, and then one sitting at elevation, so that if anything goes wrong, they can gravity feed it in. So I think the Japanese have learned a lot from that. The world's learned a lot from that. And as you say, we're not downplaying the disaster that the tsunami created by the earthquake was. I mean, a 40-meter tidal wave. Holy smoke, that's huge. So, it doesn't matter what size barriers you build, it's just not big enough for that sort of event. So, but as you say, it's not a disaster. It was an accident, and we need to put it all in perspective.
Yeah, and I think the same goes for Chernobyl. I think that Chernobyl, again, you bring up nuclear power as a fuel source. People go, look at Chernobyl, look at Fukushima. It's a disaster. I'm like, no, you have to look at the facts. And the facts are not that many. Again, we're not poo-pooing the fact that people lost their lives. Life is precious. People lose their lives in all sorts of ways. But at the end of the day, what was it, 32 people?
31, I think, is the stats I received from. I've spoken to a reputable molecular pathologist out of the UK who's done a lot of research on Chernobyl and at Fukushima, and made the point that it was 31 people died from the nuclear accident at Chernobyl. And as you say, that dates back a long way, 1986. The Russians didn't operate it very efficiently. They were doing a number of things that they shouldn't have been doing, turned off a few alarms. It's just all the things you don't do, even on a small processing plant. You don't do that, not on nuclear reactors. So they got that wrong. And then of course, the old technology. We've come a long way since that technology. So there's a few things that have changed as a result of that. But certainly, they're talking 31 deaths from that, and yet, the World Health Organization wants you to believe there's over 4,000 deaths. Well,
sorry, Murray. What are they saying? 4,000 deaths?
Well, the World Health Organization put out some numbers that 4,000, but then people have read that as deaths, but it's actually excess cancer cases. Right now, what this pathologist is telling me is that there's probably potentially about 160 people will die over the next 30, 40 years from thyroid cancer, possibly attributable to the nuclear accident. But, as you imagine, over that period of time, what if they die? What's the cancer from? Is it from smoking? Is it from, there's many, many other ways of getting cancer and hereditary, and just happens anyway. People that live in Australia that don't live near a nuclear accident, they still get cancer. So, can you actually attribute it to that? We don't know, but that's the sort of number they're saying. It's probably about that sort of number. So it's not that bad. The environment, what effect it's had on the environment? Yes, it's had some effect on the environment. And the Fukushima one, this particular person was telling me that the radiation level in the topsoil around Fukushima, which was farmed prior to the tsunami, they were clearing the topsoil off, and the inquiry was made to the Japanese. What are you doing? And eventually they answered when this person got a bit irate about them not answering, and said, well, it's we have to clear it away. The radiation level is lower than background radiation in the rest of Japan, but it just looks like the right thing to do.
Just repeat that again, Murray, just in case people missed it. So the government went in, there was farming land all around this reactor.
Yep.
And whatever they were farming, it was farming land. And the government went in and cleared all the topsoil off, saying we have to do it because it's got high levels of radiation. But those levels of radiation were lower than other parts of Japan. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. And Japan got very stringent controls on radiation in food, and it was well below any of that. So it was just a political exercise to appease people, to say, well, we're doing something about this. Whereas if they just left it alone and sent people back in there to live their own lives back to what they were doing, then there wouldn't be an issue.
What's the long-term reaction? So does that mean that given that they've got rid of the topsoil, that farming, would it be pretty much like the background that you've got there behind you?
Yeah, imagine trying to farm out in the Namib Desert. Look, as a farmer's son, you take, we have a wind event like a cyclone Tracy come through many years ago when I was young. It takes a lot of topsoil away and moves it somewhere else. You lose a lot of goodness out of your soil. So taking topsoil off, it takes many, many, many years to try and turn that sort of what's left into topsoil. So yeah, it's a long-term effect is not good. Much, much worse than the radiation.
So sorry to keep going on about it, I've got a picture in mind. So in taking away this topsoil, they've pretty much said this is a result of the nuclear reactor blow up, but actually it's not, because that topsoil didn't have high radiation. It was just done as a show.
Yeah. So now the productivity of that soil is going to be very low.
And
So
they'll
as you
blame
say,
that
it's
on
going to
the,
look like a barren land.
yeah,
And people go, look what the environment, look what you've done to the environment. Well, you actually haven't. You've taken the topsoil off. That's what you've done.
yeah.
So yeah, you can make things look how you want them to look, can't you?
Yes, you certainly can. And it's interesting. And that's why we're having this conversation today, because I'm always saying to people, you have to do your own research. You have to dig a little bit, because mainstream media, what they want to sell you is disaster and end of the world stuff. And once you dig a little bit, you go, well, actually, why is that? And you said, we were talking last week or a few days ago about the fact that here in Australia, because we do have a lot of sources of uranium here in Australia. I know yours is in Namibia. We'll talk about that in a minute. But
And Australia, we've got projects in Australia as well.
great. So if we were to use nuclear as a fuel source, and people are always talking about the cost of energy here in Australia, and it has been going up, and people are struggling at the moment. If we were, we don't use nuclear power at all. We've got Lucas Heights, which is not used at all for consumption of fuel. If we were to change even to 10%, do you think that would change the end consumer's cost of electricity?
I think if you lived in Australia and you had cheaper power, right, you see it straight away because your bills come down, and you realise that this is cleaner than anything else that we've got available to us, and nothing's blown up, then people feel a lot more comfortable. France has been living with it for, what, 40, 50 years. They generate plus 70% of their power from nuclear. Germany's gone down the path of renewables. Now, the cost of electricity in Germany is over double that of France, and their carbon emissions is 9-10 times more. And you're also seeing oil companies, natural gas companies supporting renewables because
Why is
they
that?
know, because renewables only function for 100 days a year on average, right? So the wind and the sun, right, don't shine. The sun doesn't shine 24/7. The wind doesn't blow 24/7. So they need backup power, right? And the gas companies and the oil companies know that. So they're supporting the renewables because they know they're going to get the backup power, right? So that's where a lot of money coming into renewables is. And then you go to Michael Schellenberger, and I can mention his name. He talks. He's an environmentalist that was anti-nuclear for many years, and he had a lot to do with the first solar farms in the States and the wind farms. And he now has turned around and says, well, I got it wrong. I'm very sorry, world. We as environmentalists got it wrong. And we should have been pushing nuclear. We're canning it. And you quite often see him. I follow him on Twitter, and he tweets, another blackout in California because we're moving towards renewables. We can't supply the energy at night. So we know that renewables don't give us the baseload power we need.
Yeah.
And it does cost us more because you have to have a second system. Like we looked at a mining project in WA, and the managing director of that company wanted to put in a wind farm. Well, the government were going to subsidise it, but we still had to put a diesel backup system in. So you duplicate your energy systems, and integrating those becomes more difficult. So why would you do that, right? Because the wind's never going to blow enough to generate power to run a mining operation. So it really is. Now, Michael Schellenberg's basically saying now, if you do, the science tells you we should be using nuclear, right? But the politics interferes and it pushes down the path. But going back to what you were saying, imagine if you could reduce the power costs in Australia. Right now, we're seeing China flex their muscles, whacking tariffs on most things that we send out. Although the iron ore price is nearly $160 a tonne, so they're paying us double what they were a few years back for that. But they certainly, but not everybody benefits, although the government's benefit from the royalties. So if you could reduce the power costs in Australia, and I talked to many people through this weird year we just had about buying Chinese versus buying Australian homemade. And they're saying to me, oh, well, I'd buy homemade. Now, that'll probably last 2 or 3 months until the price is too high for them and they go and buy this cheap thing out of China.
Yeah.
And so, when JobSeeker, JobKeeper come off and they'll have less money, they'll probably going down that path. Well, let's buy the cheapest we can find.
Yeah.
So, but if we can get lower power costs and we don't get labour costs too high, then we can certainly be looking at, you know, a lot of manufacturing coming back to this country, I think, and you would buy homemade, home on that basis.
Yes, because energy costs are a big part of manufacturing, big part.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
What do you think it will take? Because I guess the appetite in Australia is, because we've been fed this for so long: uranium bad, uranium burns, uranium kills, uranium cancer, uranium. You know, it's just like it plays in people's heads. Do you think that we will ever have a change in that thought process? I mean, one of the reasons I was keen to talk to you today is I've done not a lot of research, but I've listened to some people. I understand. I've looked at what France is doing. I understand that is it zero carbon emissions from nuclear power?
Well, from the process itself, I mean, pretty much zero, because when you're building it, you're still putting concrete in the steel, and you've got to manufacture that, right? So, if you want to be technical, yes, there's carbon emissions from that process, but actual running of the operation, no. So it is the lowest carbon emission power source we've got available to us. Even hydro, the amount of work that goes into hydro to build that dam, right? There's a lot of concrete and steel into that. So if you take that into account, right, nuclear is the cheapest and lowest carbon emission.
Lowest carbon emission. And so when you look at things like that, what do you think it will take for Australians to turn around and say, and have that aha moment? Because we have plenty of uranium here in Australia, don't we?
We're one of the 4 largest resources in the world for uranium. So we've got a lot of it. There's a lot at Olympic Dam. We're producing from 3 mines at the moment. So we've been producing.
What are those 3 mines, Murray?
ERA and Olympic Dam. And also we've got the ISR down in South Australia as well, sitting there, privately owned. So this uranium production has been occurring for a long time. And I think what's going to change is education. So if you look now, the background of that photo behind me is, I am not sitting in the desert in Namibia. That's a uranium project we've got there. The radiation level coming off that project, right, is lower than your granite benchtop in your kitchen, right? So there's more radiation coming out of your granite benchtop in your kitchen, and there's more radiation coming from a prefab concrete wall because granite has uranium and other metals that emit radiation. The Grand Central Station in New York is one of the highest radiation levels of any train station around, because it's built out of granite, right? So it's a matter of educating. And I've watched a movie called Pandora's Promise. I think it was produced in 2013. Great movie. There's a beach, I think it is in Brazil. I watched it a long time ago, and people go on holidays there. The radiation levels are enormous, and they just lay on the beach and they feel a lot better, right? People go to the Dead Sea. There's radiation coming out of the Dead Sea.
Is there?
And they feel better for it. Yeah. So, and then you made a comment. I mean, the radiation levels from a CT scan are astronomically higher than working at a deposit, a uranium project in Namibia for your whole life.
Yeah. So
you go and get a CT scan, and what do you think those X-ray operators and CT operators stand behind a lead reinforced wall,
a big screen? Yeah.
So, but as you say, we seem to accept the use of radiation. What's microwave? Is microwave radiation? We seem to accept that, right? We seem to accept the use of a mobile phone, right? The radiation that transfers that call. We seem to accept all that. But when it comes to nuclear energy, which has got a lower radiation levels than all these things, we seem to don't like it. So it's only education. It's only the media, the horror movie that you talk about. So we really need to try and educate people on it. And that's what blokes like Michael Schellenberger are doing now. They're coming out and saying, well, we got it wrong. This is why we got it wrong. This is what we want to tell you about it. So it is difficult when mainstream media, it's not dramatic to come out with the truth about nuclear. That's not going to sell them papers, not going to make you sit in front of the television and go, wow. Because they're going to tell you the fact, and you're going to go, oh, shit, what am I worried about?
Exactly. What am I worried about? And I think that that's really important, because there's a fear and there's a fear mongering going on at the moment, and it's not necessary. we've got something here which is a good fuel source, which is, got, as you say, almost zero carbon emissions. The carbon emissions come from the building, not the actual manufacture. Do you know much about sort of on the waste side of things? You know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, the end of the fuel rod cycle and where do we go to bury it, and you know that will create radiation which will kill everybody within 100 miles.
It doesn't take much to stop radiation. As an example, the background behind me, we've got one drill hole that has the first, from 1 meter to 2 meters below surface, runs 7,000 ppm uranium. That's a high number, a very, very high number for Namibia, right? High for Australia as well. And the surface radiation, that's the hole that has less surface radiation than your granite bench top in your kitchen, right? So it's like, yeah, look, I'm just trying to work out the words to say to try and get people to understand that it's not as bad as what you think it is. Yeah. And how do you explain that to someone? So I think I sort of lost my thought process there and what I was going to say, Kerry, but because there's so many things I want to say, and I've got a bit mixed up on it. But certainly, we don't accept it for a power source because of sentiment around what's happened in history. So the first use of uranium was probably people consider it to be the first bombs that dropped in the Second World War, right? Yeah. It's a bit like cyanide in gold mining. The first real use of cyanide was the gas chambers in the war, right? They killed all those Jews. The Germans killed all the Jews. Putting acid and sodium cyanide into cells and producing hydrogen cyanide, which I think it's 70% of the population can't smell it. So some states in the US won't allow gold mining with cyanide, and yet there's been no deaths from cyanide in gold mining in Australia's history, right? And yet 70% of the world's cyanide is used in the plastics industry. So it's accepted for that, right? But it's not accepted for some aspects of mining. And I think we're going the same way here. Radiation and nuclear is acceptable for medicine, but it's not acceptable for power, because as people have been, their thought processes have been affected by, we'll call it mainstream media, probably.
Well, it's also accepted for cooking food. If you look at a microwave oven, that's a source of radiation, isn't it? Is that correct?
One of these things, is that showing up? It's bound in the background. My mobile phone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, you accept it for convenience.
So what is a mobile phone? What's the radiation in a mobile phone?
Well, the radiation that transfers the signal, transfers your chat.
Right.
Your voice to me.
Yeah. Okay.
Different levels of radiation, different low levels, high levels, different oscillations. Yeah.
And the more we connect, the more we'll be using it. But actually, at the end of the day, the power source, which is actually confined and can be used as power, is actually a very clean source. It's a safe source, and no carbon emissions. And I think that's my main thing I wanted to get out of talking today, is to people to understand. You're all talking about climate change and saving the planet and carbon emissions. Well, here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
And the alternatives, managing director of a uranium company in Namibia said to me once, he said, if we develop a project, I'm going to be the most radiated person in the company. I said, why is that? And he says, because I'm going to fly from Australia to Namibia 3 or 4 times a year. So I'm going to get more radiation in that plane than the workers on the uranium mine in Namibia.
Is that right? I hadn't thought about that.
So, yeah, a couple of my friends, they don't want to sit on the window of the plane because I think they get more radiation. I've actually taken a scintillometer up in a flight from New Zealand back to Perth one day just to check. And certainly, you know, I don't think it makes any difference where you are in the plane, right? But you're certainly getting a higher dose of radiation in the plane than you are on the ground. But
wow,
that won't stop people traveling.
Well, no.
But it's not a dangerous.
To that, Murray.
It's not a dangerous dose anyway. It's a low dose, but you know, it is higher than working on a uranium project in Namibia. So it's not bad. And then the other thing is the alternatives. You know, what are the alternatives? If we look at renewables, and that's been forced down our throat. I mean, the government are throwing money at us here in Perth and about the rest of Australia to put solar panels on roofs, right? And you go and ask the Western Power or the main provider of power in WA, what keeps them awake at night? Well, have a guess what it is. It's 32 degrees out there now, and there's not a cloud in the sky, and all this energy is being chucked back in the grid that they've got to try and deal with, right? And then when the sun stops shining, they've got to send it straight back down the grid, right? So it's very difficult for them to do so. But I was looking at the areas, and Michael Schellenberg has brought it up before. The area required for solar panels and for wind is enormous, absolutely enormous compared to nuclear. And you know, some of it occupies, like if for England, if they try to generate enough power to replace all their oil, for produce hydrogen to replace all their oil, they need a wind farm larger than England. And if they try to do it by solar, they need a solar farm larger than Scotland. Now, where are you going to put it? Right? It's just not practical. So you have to look at the practical aspects of it as well. Whereas nuclear, you can't even see. I think I sent you that image. You can't even see the nuclear dot on the screen. So it's really.
I'll see if I can bring this up for I'll try and put it in later, but basically that's what you're talking about. There we go.
Yeah, you can see a little green arrow there, but you can't quite see the dot. So, offshore wind,
So the red one, just to be clear, the red one is wind.
Offshore wind, yeah.
And the yellow one is solar.
Solar, yeah.
And the green one is nuclear.
Yeah, and that's a green arrow pointing to a little dot. Right, so it's a huge area as well. So it's impractical, and unfortunately, wind farms are killing a lot of birds of prey. I don't understand why, but a lot of birds of prey die, and I was allergic to that about 3 or 4 years ago in Namibia, and I've gone, really? And then I heard it again recently, and Michael Schellenberg has put it up again, that is killing them. And also it's affecting bees, but I don't quite understand it. I've not gone in and done the research on it, but so there's lots of side effects of all those. And then there's one decommissioned nuclear power plant that's been fenced off in the UK, and the wildlife in that, there's endangered species are now almost no longer endangered because they're living in a fenced area. They're great. There's no predators. So yeah, it's quite a contrast, really.
Well, we're running out of time. I excuse me. I appreciate your time, Murray. But it would be rude of me not to give you 2 minutes to say, who is Marenica Energy and what are you doing? So I've got 2 minutes left. ASX code is MEY. Who are you?
Well, we know that nuclear power's consumption is increasing with time, and there's more talk about it. We need more uranium, and the supply has been cut off this year. We've really seen COVID drop supply as opposed to reducing through demand. So demand's still there. And we're one of the next, we're an explorer. We've got projects in Namibia. We've got the largest ground position for nuclear fuels in the country. We're exploring, we've explored on 2 tenements. We've hit uranium both of those. So pretty good success rate so far, and a lot more tenements to explore. We've got assets in Australia, which we bought at a song, a very cheap price. And all of that is underpinned by our upgrade beneficiation process, in-house developed and patented to protect it. And that reduces the cost of CapEx and OpEx for these particular uranium deposits that we've got by 50%. So we really stand out from our peers. We're all leveraged to uranium price. We know the uranium price is going to go up. It has to go up. But we've also got a lot of leverage to the blue sky exploration we're doing and the application of upgrade on our assets. So quite an exciting time to be at the helm of a uranium exploration company, I can tell you.
Well, you can see more about that. I recently did an interview with Murray. You can go to smallcaps.com.au. You can see an extended version of what Marenica Energy are up to. But for now, look, Murray, thanks for sharing with us and trying to educate people about the fact that nuclear energy is not as bad as you all seem to think it is. Thanks for joining us today on the Golden Alternative Investment Show.
Thank you.